Welcome to part 6, the grand finale of our study in Ecclesiastes. Way back in part 1, we read about a narrator who introduced a guy who had gathered people together. He had assembled them together in order to give them a lecture. He was an assembler. The Hebrew word was kohelet. We've been calling that guy Q ever since. And Q is describing for those who've gathered, those who are listening, his quest, his search to find the meaning of life and so many other things. Q has shared with us his observations. He's shared with us his tension, the reasons for his angst. He's shared with us the lessons he's learned along the way and the advice that he would give. Q is the main speaker all the way from the middle of chapter 1 to the middle of chapter 12, which we concluded in part 5 of this series. So here we are now. It's the narrator's turn to speak. There's just a few verses left to go in this book, and what we want to find out now is, what does the narrator think of Q's lecture? What's his reaction to it all? And the narrator gives us two reactions. First, the narrator says Q was wise, and he did a lot to help people live wisely. Q was wise. This is chapter 12, verse 9. In addition to the teacher, that's Q, being a wise man, he constantly taught the people knowledge. He weighed, explored, and arranged many proverbs. The teacher sought to find delightful sayings and write words of truth accurately. The narrator says that Q taught, he gathered, he tested proverbs, and then wrote it all down, and continues. This is verse 11. The sayings of the wise are like cattle prods, and those from masters of collections like firmly embedded nails. The sayings are given by one shepherd. The narrator says these sayings that Q was collecting and teaching are like prods and nails. They're sharp sayings that goad us into thinking deeply. They goad us into reevaluating or to taking action. They're like a wake-up call, if you will. Many years ago, my one brother, who was not, let's just say he wasn't living wisely at the time, was on his way to work, driving his boss's car. He worked construction. He worked for a company that was building sidewalks around the Galleria, actually, at that time. And he's driving down the road, and he was driving too quickly, went off the road, slammed into the embankment, totaled his boss's car. In the process, when he had the accident, when he hit, a shovel that he had in the back of the car, a work shovel, came flying forward and hit him right in the back of the head. And my brother, as he tells the story, said, it hurt, but it didn't injure him. Instead, it was like when he got hit by that shovel, it was like a wake-up call. Like he's like, I need to change my life. And so as he sat there on the side of the road, on the hood of this wrecked car, that's what he was thinking, I need to change my life. And he did. He went off to college and decided to dedicate his life to God, made some huge changes. That shovel to the back of the head was a wake-up call. I think the narrator would say that, some of the things that Q has been saying, some of the things that he taught were kind of like that for a lot of people. They were these sharp sayings. They're like, whoa, hit you. And they don't injure you. They cause enough pain. They cause enough cognitive dissonance, right? You really have to stop and you think about it. And the whole purpose is to get you to think deeply about your life, to reevaluate, to take some action, to change the way you're headed. The narrator says that's one of the great things that Q has done for us. But then the narrator shifts gears and gives us a different thought on Q's teaching. I think the narrator says something along these lines. Q muddied what is perfectly clear. Q muddied what is perfectly clear. Now, to be fair, the narrator doesn't use those words, but in stating so unequivocally the things that Q has kind of taught with ambivalence, and the narrator is implying that at best, Q missed the forest for the trees, but what I really think Q did was Q muddied some things that are perfectly clear, and I'm going to set the record straight for you. I'm going to clear back up the things that Q has kind of messed up or left in a muddy state. So what's perfectly clear according to the narrator? Let's continue verse 12. But beyond these, my son, be warned, there is no end to making of many books. With much study wearies the body. Verse 13, when all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is this: fear God and keep his commands, because this is for all humanity. For God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. So what's perfectly clear? Two things, according to the narrator. I'm going to call him N, just like we've been calling Kohelet Q. I'm going to call him N. N says, one thing that's perfectly clear is this: to fear God and keep his commands is what it means to be human. To fear God and keep his commands is what it means to be human. You saw it there in the second half of verse 13. Fear God and keep his commands, because this is for all humanity. Now, quick note. The CSB translates the back half of that, for this is for all humanity. The NIV and other versions say something like this. This is the whole duty of man. That little phrase in the original language, the Hebrew, is kind of difficult to make sense of in English. Bible scholar Christopher Wright points out that the words, the duty of, in the NIV, are added to help make some sense of the Hebrew. The Hebrew simply is this, literally: for this is the whole human. Bible scholar Jerry Shepard states that the narrator says that this fear of God and keeping of his commands is kol ha'adam. It's all of the man, literally. This is the entirety of humanity's existence. So very literally, the narrator is saying all of what it means to be human can be summed up in these few words: fear God, keep his commands. Fear God, keep his commands. That's what it means to be human. To be human, Anne says, is to be in proper relationship with God. And how do you end up in proper relationship with God? How do you know if you're in a proper relationship with God? Well, test number one: do you fear God? If you don't fear God, you don't know God, you're not properly related to him, and would say. And second, is that posture towards God translating into action? Are you keeping God's commandments? Now, let's go back to Q for a minute. Q was searching for something that would give meaning to life, wasn't he? And Q was also searching for something that applied to everyone. He talked about, under the sun, like it applies to everyone here on earth. And Q was also looking for something that was guaranteed without exceptions. Remember, that was one of his beefs with the Proverbs, is there were always exceptions. So that's what Q was looking for, right? Something that would give meaning and explanation and purpose to life, that applied to everyone, that didn't have exceptions. And the narrator saying, Q, here it is. Here it is. The essence of humanity is to be in proper relationship with God. In other words, fear God and keep his commands. Q, how did he miss it then? Because Q was looking for something and it exists. How did he miss it? Well, hang on to that thought. Youth group, one of the most favorite games is called Big Bopper. If you've ever played freeze tag, Big Bopper is kind of like that, where somebody's at and they're chasing everybody else and you try not to get tagged. And if you do get tagged, you have to get someone who is free to tag you, and so you can be free again. It's as simple as that. Big Bopper is that simple, but it has a couple differences. Number one, you always play Big Bopper in the dark. And then number two, the reason we call it Big Bopper is because the person who's it goes around bopping people. They do it with one of these. It's a pool noodle. And one of the big appeals of Big Bopper is how you tag people. When you find somebody, if you're the bopper, you take this thing, and you can't really hurt anybody with this, but what you can do is you can whack them. I'm going to step back, see if maybe we kind of get a feel for this or whatever. You can whack them good and hard, and there's that very satisfying whack sound when you, like that. When you know that you've got them, they know you got them. One of the things I always found frustrating about freeze tag is, you tag somebody and they're like, I tagged you, and they're like, no, you didn't. With Big Bopper, we don't have that problem. We know if you tagged them or not. And when you tag the person, you whack them with a bopper stick here, the pool noodle. Then what they do is they stand there and they cry and moan and cry for help until somebody comes and frees them. So that's Big Bopper. But here's the thing about Big Bopper. We would play it back in the day like once a year. And nobody ever wanted to miss that night. And when you are playing Big Bopper, everybody wanted to be the person who's running. No, they wanted to be the bopper. Why? Well, because there's just something really fun about that. Like I said, a very satisfying whack sound when you get to do it. But here's the thing, you don't get to hear that sound if you look only in places where no one is hiding. Right? If everybody's hiding over there and you're running and looking over here, you don't get, there's nobody to bop, right? Well, that's what Q did. He was on the right search. He was looking for something to explain the purpose of life and give meaning and all those things. He was right search, wrong place. Where was Q looking? Well, Q was looking in wisdom literature. He was looking in current events. He was looking in his own experience. He was looking at his own observations. Where he didn't look, where the very satisfying whack, if you will, would be, where the answer was, is in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, in God's revelation. Q was looking in the wrong place and he couldn't find a satisfying answer because of where he looked. Let's get back to what the narrator is telling us. He says, fear God. Fear God. Fear God even when you don't have answers. And might say it to us this way. We can raise our voices. That's one of the things I love about the Bible. It gives us permission. You see it in the lament psalms. You see it here. You see it in Habakkuk. You see it in Lamentations, right? We can lift our voices to God. We can raise our voices and say, God, I don't get it. God, how long? When are you going to intervene? God, why? We can raise our voices. That we are permitted to do. And I think we're even given encouragement and permission to do that. But here's what we can't do. We can never raise our fists and say, God, no. We never raise our fists in defiance. We can raise our voices in question and cry and plea. But we never raise our fists because why? We know our place. We know God. And we fear God. And then the narrator says, keep his commands. You could, I think, and would say it like this, we bow our knees, right? Why? Because we know God and we know we're going to give an account to God. And so we're going to live in a way that we are prepared for that. So that's cool. Let's talk about us for a moment. Ends conclusions, are they applicable to us? I mean, because he was living in like Old Testament days. He was under the Old Covenant. And a lot has changed since then, right? Jesus Christ has come and shown us how to live and then died on the cross and raised from the dead. That's happened since then. There's a brand new covenant between us and God since then. So Q and N were under the Old Covenant. You and I, our arrangement with God is New Covenant. We're part of the New Testament era. So does his conclusion of what we need to do, fear God, keep his commands, that was Old Testament, Old Covenant. Does that apply to people like you and me who live in the New Testament days and the New Covenant days? Well, the New Testament, second half of the Bible, and the New Covenant gives us even more reason to love and trust God than N or Q had. But N is still right. We still fear God. And the New Testament and the New Covenant give us even more motivation to obey God's commands. And the New Covenant actually simplifies God's commands, right? We're down to actually one. Love one another as I have loved you, Jesus says. So we've gone from 10, that was Old Covenant, to 1, that's New Covenant. So we've got a simplification. But N is still right. We still need to keep God's commands, or in our case, command. So yeah, this applies to us. That's thing one. That's perfectly clear. Thing two. And says there's an accounting that takes place after death. There's an accounting that takes place after death, a reckoning before God. This is verse 14. For God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil. Now, in fairness, Q talked about God's judgment, but Q seemed to have this vantage point like God only judges you on this side of the grave kind of thing. And so if you're really good, God's supposed to give you really good things. And if you're bad, then God's supposed to kill you off. That was really kind of Q's perspective. And no doubt the narrator knows that there have been evil people who lived long time, so God didn't kill them off. And there have been really good people, wise, obedient people who've died very young. So the narrator knows all that, and yet he says this so unequivocally: God's going to bring every act to judgment, whether good or evil. So the narrator seems to have this understanding, like there's something after death. Like all the judgment can't happen before you die, because some people live in a way where, you know, they seemingly got away with it, or they lost their lives early. So the judgment must come after you die. There must be some way of accounting, of justice, of making things right afterwards. Now, N was right. Jesus and John and Paul gave us even more detail about that accounting. It turns out that there's a judgment coming. Actually, there's two. There's one for Jesus' followers and one for everyone else. And it turns out that the results of that accounting will last for all eternity. Now, N didn't know that and couldn't possibly even dare to dream how God will resolve the tensions that Q felt and the tensions that Q voiced. N didn't know that. And by the way, I'm going to quote from a commentator again. N didn't know that there will be a time when the only true, wise, and righteous judge will come. And he will right all wrongs, correct all injustices, and redeem us from the absurdities of this life. That's Romans 8:20 and 21. Because he himself was not spared from suffering that very absurdity himself, being death. And he will bring us into the glorious freedom of the children of God. And when he comes, the absurdity of death will not be able to separate us from his love or from the one who himself is the resurrection and the life. John 11:25. Good stuff. Before we wrap up, let's go back to the beginning. What about Q's first question? Chapter 1, verse 3. What does a person gain for all of his efforts that he labors at under the sun? Right. That was Q's first big question and the first big quest that he went on. To try to find an answer. What do I get for all my labors under the sun? And I remember when we first talked about this, I said, some of you might be asking that same question. And some of you have let me know, yeah, that really is the question you're asking. Like, what is it that I get? What's the reward? What's the prize at the end? I'm pouring my life, blood, sweat, tears into living. What's the prize? What do I get? What makes it worthwhile? What would be making it worthwhile? Good question. Great question. What do I get for all my labors out under the sun? The answer is this. Depends on who I was working for. What do I get? It depends on who I was working for. If I was working for me, I'm working hard, I'm showing up to work, I'm trying to raise my family, I'm doing all the right things, all the things that you're supposed to do, right? Invest my money carefully or save, and if I'm doing all of that, but I'm doing it for me, what do I get? What's my reward? Well, I get some money. Hopefully, I'm pretty good at it, so I get some competencies and I get some accomplishments. In an ideal world, some people are going to recognize my competency. They're going to recognize my accomplishments, and so I'm going to get some attaboys, right? I'm going to get some praise. So I'm going to get those things. It's not like I get nothing. But here's the thing that Q realized, and that you probably all realized. It doesn't seem to be as rewarding as you thought it would be. When we were first talking about this in part 1, we talked about what would be the worst youth group game ever, right? If Big Bopper is one of the best youth group games ever, what would be the worst one ever? And we said it would be Chase the Wind, right? Where you send everybody out and you're like, okay, here's the deal, here's the game tonight. You're going to run out, and when you do, you're going to look for some breeze, look for some wind, and try to catch it in your hands, bring it back to me. The first person who brings it back shows me that they've captured the wind, wins a prize. And I remember asking when I was describing that, like, how long would you be willing to play that game, right? How long? And somebody answered in the audience, like, maybe 2 minutes, right? I think you're right. And then I pointed out, but a lot of adults have actually been playing that game, Catch the Wind, their whole lives. Like they're trying to chase that money, or those accomplishments, or that praise and those attaboys, or that sense of like, yeah, that made it worth it. Oh yes, that was worth my sacrifice. And they caught it, like they got the money, or they got the accomplishment, or they got the praise, or they got the recognition, or they got the whatever. And then when they looked at it, it's like when they opened their hands, it was gone already. Like there was this euphoria, but it did not last a week. Many times it didn't last a day. Sometimes it didn't last an hour. It was like wind. As soon as you knew it, it was gone. There was nothing there. No lasting satisfaction. And so what do I get for all my labors under the sun if I'm working and laboring and it's all about me? Well, I'll get some things. But my fear is that at the end, or even before you get to the end, you'll realize what you've done is you've caught the wind, and when you catch the wind, you've caught nothing. But that isn't the only option, is it? Like, I'm not the only one that I can work for. I can choose instead to work for God. So what do I get? What does the laborer get if he works for God? If I work for God, when I get to the end, it's not wind. It's well done. It's well done. It's those words from God himself. Well done, good and faithful servant. Well done. You have used what I gave you, and you've made the most of what I gave you. And you have done the very will and work of my Father in heaven. Well done. You get that. The second thing you get is reward from God. Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 to 24, Matthew 6, Matthew 10, verse 42, all talk about this reward, that our Father sees what we do, and if we're doing it for him, then we'll get a reward from him. So what do I get for all my labors under the sun? Well, it depends on who it was that I was working for. Let's bring this series to a close, shall we? You know, by God's grace, we know more about God's plan than Q or even N, right? We know about Jesus. We know a lot more about heaven. We know about hell. Right? We know a lot more. That's God's grace. It's not because we're smarter than Q was or smarter than the narrator was, right? It's God's grace. We know more because God has revealed more. But you and I, we still have knowledge gaps. We know a lot more, but there are still things that we don't know. We still have unanswered questions. We still feel the tension between our faith and reality as we see it, right? We still feel that tension. There are still mysteries. There are still paradoxes. Things like, God, how can this be true and this be true? And God, what about this? And again, there are things that God has promised that we've not experienced yet. And there are things that God has promised and we're like, I don't see how that could ever come true in my life. And I don't see how that could ever come true in this world. We still have those things. So we know a lot more, but it hasn't solved it. The tension has not all gone away. So what do we do? What do we do? Because to some degree, we're still like Q, right? Things we don't know. Tensions we still feel. Angst that still plagues us in our gut. Here are the questions that I want to end with. Number one, will we let all of that, the gaps, the tensions, the angst, the mysteries, the paradoxes, will we let all of that muddy what is perfectly clear? From time to time I hear Pastor Joel say this line, don't doubt in the dark what was perfectly clear in the light. I think that's great advice. turned it around to a question: will we let those things that we don't get, the mysteries, the paradoxes, the things we can't figure out how to solve and how it goes together, will we let them muddy what is perfectly clear? The things that the narrator taught, the things that Jesus has promised. Will we let them muddy what is perfectly clear? And question number 2, will we keep giving God our trust vote when our faith doesn't remove the tension? I've said before, one of the greatest acts of worship you can give is your trust vote. When you say, like, this doesn't look right, or I don't know how this is going to turn out, God, but I trust you anyways. I'm putting a vote in your column, God. I am voting to put my trust in you rather than my trust in my doubts, or my trust in my own ability, or my trust in whatever. God, I put my trust in you again today. That's the question that I think Q and the narrator help us to wrestle with. Will we keep giving God our trust vote when our faith doesn't remove the tension? With that question, we end our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. Thanks for joining me in this and working through this, following Q's quest, living in the tension. Guys, I hope that this study has been as helpful for you as it has been for me.